American history is so complex. Even how we understand our history is complex.
Protesters were out today pushing for the removal of a statue at Columbus Park.
This symbol must come down.
When conservatives are trying to stave off the left as they come for George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, their sort of defense will be, well, at that time period, everybody owned slaves, and we're the first country to abolish slavery, and these types of things.
The American Revolution caused people to question slavery. That birthed abolition movements.
I was very offended for him to say that nobody criticized slavery until the slave-holding American founding fathers decided to raise it. Disqualifies 200 years.
When progressives raise the slave-holding legacy of our founding fathers to conservatives, the conservative response is generally, these are men of their times and they have to be understood as such. But some of the same conservatives will turn around and indict King and say his views are so incompatible with the American founding and our principles that we should reconsider the extent to which we lionize him.
The whole reason that we even lionize or popularize someone like a Martin Luther King, who, by the way, was an all-out Marxist, who didn't believe in God. He said so in his own papers, that he did not believe in the resurrection of the Christ. That's very strange for someone who professes to be a Christian pastor. He didn't write any of his speeches. His dissertation was plagiarized. Those in his inner circle, his speechwriters, were themselves communists. Stanley Levison was a treasurer for a communist front group in New York. Bayard Rustin was a communist. He's the one who taught Martin Luther King the strategy of nonviolence. He was a concoction.
To me, it's logically inconsistent to say that the slave master should be given due deference and have his positions analyzed with a sense of nuance. But the commie is once and for all and forever will be outside of the bounds of any type of respect and honor in terms of our political history. I can certainly more so understand why a Southern Baptist preacher who is maybe 2 generations removed from slavery would be in favor of Marxism than I can the co-founders of BLM in 2016. I'm not saying I agree with King's economic philosophy, but I understand why he would have it.
Well, touche. But the reality is that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement served in America as a kind of Marxist Trojan horse. From the outside, it appeared to be moderate and pro-American.
This is a gift. We should take it to the temple of Poseidon.
And it's for this reason that America accepted it. But when you look at the results that followed, which were intentional, an expanded government, various socialist policies, a heightened welfare state, the facts reveal that this wasn't ignorance, but malice. They quite literally wanted to Sovietize America. In a 1965 interview, Bettina Aptheker said that the American political landscape is the perfect one for communism because Americans believe that they live in a democracy.
Communist philosophy or socialism easily and has to adapt to the country in which it's taking place. In this country, there will never be socialism unless the overwhelming majority of the American people passionately want it, and want it so badly that they're going to go out and get it. It's one of the things that gets me so excited when I start thinking about the possibilities of socialism in this country. The civil rights movement has already begun to develop a certain program. It is revolutionary, and it is also, I think, much more democratic.
So you can democratize social issues, and you can, in a sense, pull out the heartstrings of America. They will then let their guard down, and they will democratize socialism into reality. And so I don't see Martin Luther King fighting against that. I see Martin Luther King as a participant in that, which is a subversive thing.
It seems to me that the civil rights movement must now begin to organize for the guaranteed annual income, begin to organize.
The question arises, well, what other options did he have? Well, for me, I think one of the reasons why there's such a mental block for people is because we've all went to the same schools. We all graduated from the same schools. We all read the same textbooks. You know, we all understand how MLK was this good moral leader who came to, in a sense, deconstruct the way things were. And there was no one else. No one else knew how to do it. But Martin Luther King, here's a guy who got it. And he was a Christian pastor, and he was all these things. Much of what we have learned about him turned out to be either false or inaccurate or, you know, a myth or what have you.
Dr. J.H. Jackson, head of the largest Negro church organization in America, the National Baptist Convention USA, with nearly 7 million members, has warned constantly that communists are directing the revolutionary activities of the radical black power.
There were other people like Joseph H. Jackson who believed in the fundamental Christian gospel, not the social gospel, not liberation theology, the fundamental Christian gospel, the inerrancy of the scriptures, the resurrection of Christ. Like, he believed in those things fundamentally.
What is your feelings toward the new black theology?
Those of us who are Christians, we don't believe that you can have a theory of God based on color. I don't believe.
When you look at his engagement in civil rights, it wasn't this same brand of civil rights that MLK was pushing, in that we vest certain unconstitutional powers in the federal government, which widens that power and in a sense usurps our rights as Americans. Because, you know, to Bob Woodson's point, we shouldn't have given the federal government the right to force businesses to integrate. Rather, we should have merely taken away the state's right to segregate.
Integration was never our goal. We never saw integration as a solution to the problems. We were seeking desegregation. And I think confusion on that point has continued to erode the collective self-confidence of the black community today. So integration was never an issue for me or for many others, but it was the issue that I think separated me from the civil rights movement.
Both the problem and MLK's solution are unconstitutional, says Bob Woodson, says Barry Goldwater, and many others, even Malcolm X, ironically.
Any effort to force integration upon whites is actually hypocritical. It is a form of hypocrisy involved. If a white man puts his arm around me voluntarily, that's brotherhood. But if you hold a gun on him and make him embrace me and pretend to be friendly or brotherly toward me, then that's not brotherhood, that's hypocrisy.
When I look at someone like a Joseph H. Jackson, he argued that to the extent that the white man doesn't give you a job, it's incumbent upon you to build your own businesses and to hire your brother and your sister and your neighbor, that you aren't begging someone else for a job. And so he didn't only talk about this, but he exemplified this. There were a bunch of sharecroppers in the South who were getting cheated by farmers. Jackson was the president of the National Baptist Convention. The convention bought 400 acres of farmland in the South, and they allowed these black sharecroppers to work the land for free. And to the extent that they raised money for their crops, they got to keep and pocket that money so long as they were saving that money to buy their own farmland, so they can move from sharecroppers to farmers and not have to depend on anybody else for their daily bread. The convention, under the behest of Jackson, did many of these things. Now, the reason why I bring up Jackson in comparison to Martin Luther King is because, as you know, Ebenezer Baptist Church was under the umbrella of the National Baptist Convention. Martin Luther King, fresh out of Crozer, very young, very ambitious, he wanted to be the president of the National Baptist Convention. He was overwhelmingly rejected, and it got pretty contentious. Someone was pushed off a stage and died. Someone from Martin Luther King's little ilk pushed this young man off the stage and he died. So it got pretty contentious, and they ended up kicking Martin Luther King and his friends out of the National Baptist Convention. This was before his face was plastered on Time magazine and all the rest of it. So what they decided to do, at the suggestion of Stanley Levison, was start a new Baptist convention which would rival the National Baptist Convention. So they started the Progressive National Baptist Convention. Of course, it didn't take off. It didn't do anything. So they started this Southern Leadership Conference, and then they moved from there to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and its concoction was the result of the fact that Martin Luther King and his campaign was not popular to these Negroes in the South as much as Joseph H. Jackson, who was a continuation of the kinds of things that Booker T. Washington talked about. Martin Luther King wanted to move the National Baptist Convention into a new, more radical, if I can use that word, social gospel, and to get away from the kind of fundamental gospel that Joseph H. Jackson and his ilk was preaching. He failed to do so, started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The advantage that Martin Luther King and his ilk had that Joseph H. Jackson did not have is that once the success of the Montgomery bus boycott took off and all the things, the media basically swarmed around Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. They made him larger than life. Stanley Levison, who was a phenomenal publicist, he's the one who lined up the interviews, who was able to mobilize the media to put cameras in front of the civil rights movement under the behest of Martin Luther King, and the rest is history. Mm-hmm. And so Joseph H. Jackson was all but erased from these kinds of conversations that we talk about. It always comes down to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
The founding fathers were trying to wrestle away their right to independence, not by way of deception, but by way of laying it all out on the table. They issued a Declaration of Independence, said this is what we do not mm-hmm. like about mm-hmm. our leadership, about our government, mm-hmm. and we are going to go to war to fight for our freedom. Martin Luther King and his ilk didn't so much issue a similar kind of Declaration of Independence. A lot of the things that he did for which he is lionized, if it's true that those things were done as a subversive tactic, is it then fair to compare him to someone like the founding fathers?
As is always the case, whenever I see something that you produce, I'm learning a lot. I wasn't particularly familiar with Joseph H. Jackson, so that'll give me some homework to do. I think the comparison to the founding fathers is fair in that mm-hmm. in life, a man's creeds often at various points in his life will not match his deeds. Mm-hmm. And yes, did the founding fathers struggle with slavery? Sure, to some extent. But I'm not a person that says, oh, we need a new founding, we need new national symbols, because I understand that people are flawed. And I'm not arrogant enough to think that because those men had their moral inconsistencies, that we in our generation don't have our own. I do not agree with lionizing or deifying any person, but I think we should deal with everyone's legacy openly, honestly, and consistently. And that is where I tend to come down on these things. Would a different set of leaders during that era have produced different results? Quite possibly. Yeah, it's quite possible. And I do share your sentiment in terms of the difference between integration and desegregation. But I also know I have the luxury of having that opinion, having never grown up in a segregated, quote unquote, school. Now, to be fair, and I know you're a historian, so you know these things, there are multiple examples across history, even recent history, of despised minority groups flourishing economically in certain countries. But again, when you are a small minority in a country that is openly hostile to you, even if you dominate part of the economy, sometimes that can make the majority even more hostile. So there's a sense in which the law is there to protect you. So net, we benefit from the national correction that he helped sort of institute in terms of passing some of those civil rights laws, voting rights laws, so on and so forth. But the heirs to King's throne, so to speak, particularly the black preachers and the politicians, and I'd include the pundits, the professors and the performers, the people I call the aristocracy, who think that they are operating his legacy, and you made this point earlier, the ones who see systemic racism and income inequality as bigger sins than sin itself. I think those men and women have, in many respects, squandered the legacy. They have acquired a tremendous amount of political power and political capital. Black folks are in corporate America and in the C-suite and became president and all so on and so forth. But I would argue that these people sort of secured the bag, so to speak, but fumbled the ball. And I think the people who tried to copy him have made, in many respects, things worse in the black community.
Respectfully, I don't believe that these individuals, the William Barbers, the Jesse Jacksons, the Al Sharptons, and others, the liberation theologians, as you put it, I don't believe that they are a deviation from MLK, nor do I believe that they hijacked MLK or try to, in a sense, merely mimic MLK. I think that they are a continuation of MLK. And had MLK not been assassinated, he would have been doing the same things that Jesse Jackson and others were doing. The reason I can say that definitively is because you see him doing that prior to his having been assassinated, where he was going into these towns and basically, like, the whole nonviolent thing is so brilliant. It's just so brilliant because you build these kind of situations in these moments and you know what's going to happen. You know what's going to ensue. You do all of this knowing that the threat at the end of all of it is a riot, an all-out riot. And you can then use that as political fodder.
A riot is the language of the unheard. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
The whole point of nonviolence is you get people into the streets, you don't pull permits so that the traffic can be regulated and the noise can be controlled and all the things. You have these unlawful marches, and to the extent that the sheriff's department shows up and tries to remove you, if you aren't being compliant, you're continuing marching, then they have to necessarily remove you by force. And not only that, but a lot of these individuals who were a part of the marches weren't themselves Southerners. These were freedom riders and others who were coming down from the North and being agitative. When you look at what Jesse Jackson was doing in the 90s, where they were going to these predominantly white corporations that were situated in predominantly white areas, and they were saying that they were discriminating because they don't have enough black employees. Again, these same kind of shakedown tactics that MLK was doing, so too was Jesse doing in the 90s. And so I don't know that MLK would have been displeased with what his proverbial sons were doing, because he was doing the same exact things. And not only that, philosophically, ideologically, he aligned with where these people are for that reason. I don't know. I think we have enough evidence to say definitively where MLK would have landed.
I do want to address the point that you made, right? And this is here's my sort of overarching response. It's that, you know, we may think that based on a person's trajectory, we have a sense of where they would land. And oftentimes that's the best that you can do. But I often remind myself, like Eldridge Cleaver, who I think started off as the Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, when he died in 1998, he was a conservative Republican who was a part of the Church of Latter-day Saints, right? So it's not to say that a person can't change their perspective over time, because many do. Thomas Sowell is famous for saying that he used to be a Marxist, and then one summer working at the Department of Labor sort of did what classes with Milton Friedman could not do, which is to make him drop his Marxist leanings. Well, Justice Thomas said, you know, that he I don't know if he was officially part of the Black Panthers, but he certainly was sympathetic to their ideology. So
yeah, that's true.
And then the other thing I'm just, and this is sort of a cultural thing, and not to be, you know, take it with a grain of salt, but the show the Boondocks, which probably could not be made nowadays, when they had the MLK episode and you know the Dr. King, was resurrected from the dead.
Yeah.
Oh no.
He was very critical of things that he saw in the black community.
What happened, Huey? What happened to our people?
Yeah, but this was a cartoon.
True, but what I'm saying is it's a cartoon, and they could have written his character in any number of different ways. They could have made him permed out Al Sharpton clone, but they didn't. It's hard to say where a person would end up, particularly when you're talking about someone who's assassinated in his late 30s, I want to say 39, where he would have ended up at 60 years old. Because people do mature. Oftentimes they become more conservative with age. They would get to see how their ideas ended up being used and what the results were. I find it hard to believe that Dr. King thought to himself, and one day, the guys that come after me, they are going to make sure that pregnant men have access to reproductive health care. I find that very, very hard to believe. Now, maybe gay rights stuff, given that Bayard Rustin was one of his closest advisors, maybe. But even that, at that time, would have been something along the lines of gay men mimicking the sort of bourgeoisie, suburban values, being able to get a job at NBC and buy a house with their partner, roommate, that type of thing, and pass on property. That I highly doubt, even in Bayard Rustin's wildest dreams, that he was thinking, look, the first black president is going to be in office when gay marriage is made legal in the United States. And soon after that is going to come transgenderism and a drag queen in every school. I find that hard to believe. And that's what the guys today are pushing. So what I'm saying is I want to hold them responsible for their own beliefs, for their worldview, for their positions. And to the extent that they are trading on, I don't want to say trading on King's legacy, because I get the point you're making. I think what they're doing is extending King's legacy by saying, this is the new civil rights battle of the day. Trans issues, all things LGBT, all things pride. These are the new civil rights issues of the day. Gays and lesbians are the new oppressed group in America. And we, as the NAACP, are going to do what we've always done, which is stand up for the marginalized and oppressed. And we're going to continue that rich legacy. I think that's more what it is. And is that a continuation of what Dr. King started? Sure, I think it's fair to put some of that there. But these people are also embracing things that no one could have envisioned in the 1960s.